The day Salith Vinora married a human, she felt nothing at all. That was the point. The marriage was never meant to be real. It was a transaction. A piece of paper wrapped in ceremony and politics, designed to pull humanity's small fleet into the Concorde's war machine without giving humans anything that actually mattered in return. She stood at the altar of the Grand Concorde Hall, towering over her husband-to-be at 7 feet and 2 inches tall, her pale blue skin glowing softly with the bioluminescence of her species. Her silver eyes looked down at James Morrow with the same expression she used when reviewing trade reports. He was short by her standards, plain. He wore the simple dark uniform of Earth's Colonial Bureau, and he stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, like a man waiting for a bus. Around them, delegates from 14 alien species filled the observation galleries. Most of them were not there to celebrate. They were there to watch, to take note, and in many cases, to laugh quietly behind their hands. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concorde only 3 years ago. They were the newest members, the smallest fleet, the youngest civilization in the room by tens of thousands of years. The idea that an Aelithari sovereign heir was marrying one of them was, to most of the galaxy, either a joke or a tragedy. Chancellor Dreth had designed it that way. He was the old Aelithari political mind behind the arrangement, and he had explained it to Salith with the cold precision she had always admired in him. The Virathi Dominion was expanding. War was coming. The Concorde needed every ship it could get, and Earth had ships. Not many, but enough to fill gaps. The marriage would bind humanity to the Concorde's defense pact through the oldest and most unbreakable form of alliance in Aelithari law. And in return, humanity would get protection for its scattered colonies. Choose someone expendable, Dreth had told her. Someone quiet. Someone who will not cause problems. They had chosen James Morrow, a mid-level diplomat, 41 years old, former military strategist who had served in something called the Third Terran Unification War, which none of the Aelithari analysts considered important enough to study in detail. He had left the military, become a diplomat, and spent the last decade negotiating minor colonial disputes. He was, by every measure that mattered to the Concorde, nobody. The ceremony was beautiful in the way that political events always were. There were lights and ancient Aelithari hymns, and an exchange of bonding crystals that meant everything to her people, and nothing to him. When Salith placed the crystal in James's hand, she looked at his face for any sign of emotion. He simply closed his fingers around it, nodded once, and said, "Thank you," as if she had passed him the salt. The reception afterward was worse. The grand hall was filled with the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and every single one of them treated James like furniture. Salith watched from across the room as a group of Concorde admirals stood near a holographic star map, drinks in hand, speaking loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. "The humans sent us a clerk," Admiral Vorath of the Draenei said, its 4 eyes blinking with amusement. "I have seen their fleet reports. 60 ships, 60. My personal escort has more firepower than their entire navy." The others laughed. A Thessari commander with iridescent scales swirled her drink and added, "At least they breed quickly. Perhaps we can use them as ground troops." More laughter. Salith felt a small flicker of something that might have been embarrassment on behalf of her new husband, but she pushed it away. This was the arrangement. James was not meant to be respected. He was meant to be present. She looked for him and found him standing alone near the far wall, close to the large holographic display showing the Concorde's territorial map. He had a small glass of something in one hand, untouched, and he was staring at the map. Not glancing, not admiring. He was studying it the way a surgeon studies a body before cutting. His eyes moved from system to system, tracing the border lines, the fleet positions, the supply routes. His free hand hung at his side, and his fingers were moving very slightly, as if he were counting something. No one else noticed. No one was looking at him. Salith turned away and rejoined the conversation with her advisors, and the evening continued as planned. James spoke to almost no one. He shook the hands that were offered, and answered questions politely and briefly. When a Karathi delegate asked him what humanity hoped to contribute to the Concord, he smiled slightly and said, "Whatever is needed." The Karathi laughed, thinking it was modesty. Salith, from 10 feet away, was not entirely sure it was. That night, they were shown to their shared quarters aboard the diplomatic station. The rooms were large and cold, designed for Elithari comfort, which meant high ceilings, dim blue light, and very little warmth. James looked around without complaint, set his single bag on a chair, and said, "I will take the smaller room, if that is acceptable." "It is," Salith said. He nodded and walked to the door of the side chamber. Then he stopped and turned back. "The border stations along the Vairathi front," he said. "How many of them have been reinforced in the last 6 months?" She blinked. "That is a military matter." "How many?" "I do not know the exact number." "Why?" He looked at her for a moment, and there was something behind his eyes that she had not seen at the ceremony or the reception. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the look of a man who had already done the math and did not like the answer. "No reason," he said. "Good night, Sovereign." He closed the door, and Salith stood alone in the blue light, feeling for the first time that she might have underestimated something. 3 days later, the Vairathi Dominion attacked. A massive raiding fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel above the colony world of Sathari Prime, and burned it to glass in under 4 hours. 3 million people died before the Concord could even schedule a response meeting. The emergency session of the War Council was chaos. 14 species screamed at each other across the chamber, each one blaming the others, each one demanding action while offering nothing. Salith sat in her seat and watched the galaxy begin to crack apart in real time. And across the chamber, in the observer's gallery, she saw James. He was the only person in the room who was not shouting. He was not even looking at the arguing delegates. He was looking down at a datapad, writing something with quick, steady hands. His face was calm. Not empty, not cold. Calm in the way that deep water is calm, because everything dangerous is happening below the surface. Salith watched him write, and she wondered, for the first time, what exactly Earth had sent her. The war began badly and then got worse. In the first 6 weeks, the Concord lost 3 major engagements against the Vairathi Dominion. Not because they lacked ships. The Concord had thousands of warships from 14 different species, each one built to different standards, running different systems, following different tactical doctrines that had been developed over thousands of years of separate history. On paper, the combined fleet was the largest military force ever assembled in the galaxy. In practice, it was a mess. The Draenei wanted to charge headfirst into every engagement with overwhelming force. The Thessarai preferred long-range bombardment from safe distances. The Karathi believed in rigid formations that never changed once battle started. The Elithari commanded from the rear, directing fleets like pieces on a game board, calm and precise, and always 3 steps behind the enemy. Nobody wanted to take orders from anyone else. Every admiral believed their species had the superior approach, and every battle plan was a compromise that satisfied no one and achieved nothing. The Vairathi, who had a single unified command and a single doctrine, cut through them like a blade through paper. Salith attended every session of the War Council aboard the flagship Throne of Stars. Her role was ceremonial. She was sovereign heir, which gave her an advisory seat, but no real authority over military operations. She sat, she listened, and she watched the war slip away. She also noticed that James was always there. He sat in the observer's gallery at every open session, a datapad on his knee, writing constantly. He never spoke. He never asked questions. He just watched and wrote. At first, Salith assumed it was boredom or curiosity, the idle habits of a diplomat with nothing to do. But after the third week, she realized he was not taking casual notes. Pages and pages of analysis, diagrams, fleet movement predictions. She could see it from across the chamber, when the light caught his screen at the right angle. One evening, after a particularly disastrous council session, in which 3 admirals had nearly started a physical fight, Salith went to his quarters. She did not knock. She was sovereign heir, and technically, everything aboard this station was under her authority. James was sitting at his desk, surrounded by holographic projections of fleet data. He looked up when she entered, unsurprised. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Watching the war," he said. "You are not watching. You are analyzing. I want to know why." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her steadily. There was no challenge in his expression, no defensiveness, just a kind of tired honesty. "Because you are losing," he said, "and I do not think you see why." She felt a flash of irritation. The Concorde has the finest military minds in the galaxy. The Concorde has 14 different military minds that refuse to become one, he said. Your fleet is not losing because the Virathi are stronger. You are losing because your command structure is broken. Every engagement follows the same pattern. Your admirals argue about formation for 2 hours, compromise on something nobody believes in. Then the Virathi hit the weakest point of that compromise before you can adapt. You are predictable, Sovereign, and in war, predictable means dead. Salith stared at him for a long time. No one had spoken to her like that in her entire life. Not with disrespect, but with a bluntness that her culture simply did not practice. Elithari communicated in layers, in implications, in the careful arrangement of words that allowed everyone to preserve dignity. James spoke the way humans apparently did everything. Straight ahead, no cushion, no apology. You believe you could do better, she said. It was not a question. I believe anyone could do better than what I am watching, he said. But yes, I have ideas. She tested him. She did not trust him yet, not even a little, but she was curious enough to see if his confidence had anything behind it. She gave him access to classified fleet movement data from the last 3 engagements, and told him to predict where the Virathi would strike next. He studied the data for one night. The next morning, he gave her an answer. The Virathi would hit the supply depot at Kasara Station within 8 days, approaching from the galactic south through a sensor gap created by the Concorde's own patrol schedule. 6 days later, the Virathi hit Kasara Station, exactly from the galactic south, exactly through the sensor gap James had identified. She just looked at him across the briefing table, while alarms blared in the distance, and something in her understanding of this man shifted permanently. Then came the Battle of Shale Drift, and everything fell apart. The Concorde sent a major fleet to defend the Shale system, a critical waypoint between the inner worlds and the front lines. The admirals argued. They compromised. They deployed in a formation that tried to satisfy everyone, and protected no one. The Virathi tore through them in under 3 hours. 200,000 Concorde soldiers died. Among them was Admiral Kathos, the senior Elithari fleet commander, and one of the most respected military leaders in the Ascendancy. The council was in shock. Salith felt the grief of her people like a physical weight. But underneath the grief, she felt something harder and colder. Anger at the council for letting pride kill 200,000 people. She used every bit of political authority she had. She forced the War Council to open the floor to outside analysis. And then she called James to the podium. He walked in wearing his plain Earth uniform, carrying nothing but his datapad. 14 species stared at him, some with curiosity, most with contempt. He did not ease into it. He did not offer sympathy or soften his words. He put up a holographic projection showing the Concorde's losses over 6 weeks. the patterns in Virathi attacks, and the structural failures in the Concorde's command chain. Then he said the thing that made the room go silent. At the current rate of loss, the Concorde will fall within 8 months. Not because the Virathi are unbeatable, but because this alliance would rather lose a war than let someone else lead it. The room erupted. Admiral Vorath slammed his fist on the table. 3 delegates stood up shouting. A Thessari commander called James an insult that did not translate well, but clearly involved his species' lifespan and the size of Earth's sun. James stood through all of it, without moving. When the noise died down, he laid out his proposal. A unified command structure, mixed species battle groups, trained to work together. Asymmetric tactics, drawn from Earth's long and bloody military history. Fast adaptation, deception, controlled aggression. Everything the Concorde was too proud to consider. Chancellor Dreth stood from his seat, his face rigid with cold authority. This is absurd, a human telling the oldest civilizations in the galaxy how to fight. This marriage was meant to secure a few ships, not hand a primitive species the keys to our war. Salith felt every eye turn to her. She was supposed to agree with Dreth, to gently silence her human husband, to preserve the order of things. Instead, she stood up. I have reviewed his analysis, she said, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. His prediction of the Kasara attack was accurate to within 2 days and matched the exact vector of approach. His assessment of our command failures is consistent with our own classified post-battle reports, which none of you wanted to read. She paused. I suggest we stop discussing where the messenger comes from and start listening to the message. The chamber was silent. Dreth stared at her with something between shock and fury. She held his gaze until he looked away. The council voted. By a thin margin, James was granted a provisional tactical advisory role. No command authority, no fleet control. Just the right to sit in the room and offer suggestions. It was everything. 48 hours later, a Virathi armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Concorde's most important industrial world. Alarms screamed. Officers ran to stations. The senior admiral on duty, a Draenei named Vorath, stared at the tactical display and froze. The enemy fleet was twice the size they had expected, deployed in a formation he had never seen before. Every officer on the bridge looked at each other. Then, one by one, they turned and looked at James, who was standing near the back of the command center, with his arms crossed. May I? He asked. James did not take the admiral's chair. He did not push anyone aside or raise his voice. He walked to the central tactical display, looked at the incoming Virathi formation for approximately 10 seconds, and then began to speak in a voice so calm it almost sounded bored. Move the Thessari long-range group to bearing 77, offset 15 degrees below the orbital plane. Pull the Draenei heavy cruisers back to the second defensive line. Do not engage yet. I want the Karathi screening frigates forward, spread wide, running active sensors at full power. Admiral Vorath stared at him. You want the frigates in front? They will be destroyed in the first exchange. They will not be destroyed, James said, because the Virathi will not fire on them yet. They will read the sensor output as the signature of a much larger force behind the screen. It will buy us 4 minutes. I need those 4 minutes. Vorath opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He gave the order. What happened over the next 3 hours became the most studied naval engagement in the history of the Galactic Concorde. Military academies on 100 worlds would eventually teach it. They would call it the Battle of Meridian Core, and they would struggle to explain how a species that had only been in space for 2 centuries had produced a mind that could do what James Morrow did that day. He did not fight the way any Concorde species fought. He did not form neat lines. He did not seek a clean, decisive clash of forces. Instead, he turned the battle into chaos, and then he lived inside that chaos like it was his home. He used the frigate screen to create a false image of the Concorde fleet's size and position. When the Virathi adjusted their formation to meet the imagined threat, he hit them from an angle they had left exposed. When they turned to face the real attack, he pulled those ships back and struck from somewhere else. He gave ground freely, retreating in ways that looked like panic, but were actually drawing the enemy deeper into positions where their own formation worked against them. The Concord officers on the bridge watched with wide eyes. The Thessari weapons commander kept saying, "That is not possible," over and over again, as James repositioned her ships into firing solutions she would never have imagined. The Virathi commander, clearly confused by an enemy that refused to behave according to any known pattern, made a critical mistake. He committed his reserve fleet to chase what he thought was a retreating Concord battle group. It was a trap. James had placed his heaviest ships in a silent drift behind a gas cloud, engines cold, waiting. When the Virathi reserves passed the cloud, the Concord ships powered up and fired everything they had into the enemy's unshielded rear. The Virathi formation broke. What had been an organized armada became a scattered, panicking collection of ships trying to regroup while James kept hitting them from every direction. He used speed, deception, misdirection, and a willingness to take risks that made the alien officers physically uncomfortable. But there was a cost. Midway through the battle, James ordered a group of 12 Concord frigates to charge directly into the heart of the Virathi formation. Everyone on the bridge knew what that meant. Those frigates would not survive. Their job was to draw fire and create an opening for the main fleet to deliver the killing blow. James gave the order without hesitation. His voice did not change. His hands did not shake. He watched 12 green dots on the tactical display advance into a wall of red, and he did not look away as they disappeared one by one. The opening they created was enough. The main Concord fleet surged through the gap and shattered the Virathi flagship's escort formation. Within 30 minutes, the battle was over. The Virathi armada was destroyed or in full retreat. Meridian Core was saved. The bridge erupted in celebration. Officers from 6 different species were shouting, embracing, some of them weeping with relief. It was the first decisive Concord victory of the war. James did not celebrate. He stood at the tactical display, staring at the empty space where 12 frigates had been. His face was perfectly still. Then he turned, walked to a quiet corner of the bridge, and sat down. He put his hands on his knees. Salith, who had watched the entire battle from the observation deck above, came down and found him there. His eyes were open, but he was somewhere far away. "James," she said. 843 people on those frigates, he said quietly. "I knew their survival probability was less than 4% when I gave the order." She did not know what to say. In Elithari culture, sacrifice in war was honored with ritual and poetry. It was made beautiful. There was nothing beautiful about the way James carried it. He carried it like a stone in his chest, heavy and sharp and permanent. "You saved this world," she said. "I know," he said. "That does not help as much as people think it does." Word of the victory spread across the Concord within hours. For the first time, the alien species stopped to actually look at humanity, not as a minor species with a small fleet, but as something they had failed to understand. Military analysts from every Concord world began pulling up Earth's history, and what they found changed the way they looked at humans forever. Thousands of years of war, continuous, unbroken, stretching back to the very beginning of human civilization. They had fought with rocks, then swords, then guns, then bombs that could crack a planet. They had fought each other across continents, across oceans, and finally across their own solar system. They had industrialized war, mechanized it, digitized it, and perfected it in ways that no other species in the Concord had ever done, because no other species had needed to. The Elithari had fought 3 wars in their entire history. The Thessari had fought 5. The Drenai, the most warlike of the Concord species, had fought perhaps 20 significant conflicts in 10,000 years. Humans had fought thousands, and they were still here. Not despite the wars, but in some terrible way because of them. Every war had made them sharper, faster, more adaptive. They had learned lessons in blood that other species had never needed to learn, and those lessons were burned into their bones. The Virathi Dominion, too, took notice. Their intelligence division had profiled every species in the Concord before the war. They had detailed assessments of Aelithari strategy, Drenai aggression, Thessari technology. Their files on humanity were 3 pages long, and concluded with the assessment, minor species, no strategic relevance. After Meridian Core, those files were thrown out. The Concord War Council convened an emergency session. The vote was contentious, loud, and bitter, but the result was clear. James Morrow was formally appointed Supreme Tactical Commander of the Combined Fleet, the first human to hold command authority over alien military forces in the history of the galaxy. Chancellor Dreth voted against it. Several admirals voted against it. But Salith stood before the council and staked her political future on the appointment. And when the sovereign heir of the Aelithari ascendancy put her name on something, the galaxy listened. That night, Salith found James alone in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars. She stood beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "I need to ask you something," she said. "How do you do it? How do you send people to die and then keep going?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You do not keep going. Not really. You just don't stop. There is a difference." She looked at him, and she saw something she had never expected to see in this marriage of politics and convenience. She saw a man who was carrying something enormous, something that bent him but had not broken him, and who had chosen to carry it anyway because someone had to. She realized she respected him, not because he had won a battle, because he felt the cost of it and did not pretend otherwise. 2 days later, intercepted Virathi communications reached the Concord Intelligence Service. The Dominion High Command had reassigned their most feared military leader to the Concord campaign. Archon Corvale, the conqueror of 11 civilizations, the strategist who had never lost a war. His orders were simple and total. But it was the final line of the intercepted message that Salith read 3 times before setting it down. It read, "Identify and eliminate the human. He is the war." She looked across the room at James, who was already reading the same report with the same steady calm he brought to everything. He looked up, met her eyes, and said nothing. But she saw something shift in his expression. Not fear, recognition. He had been here before, in some other war, on some other world. He knew what it meant when the enemy stopped fighting your army and started hunting you personally. The real war was about to begin. Archon Corvale was nothing like the Virathi commanders who had come before him. The previous generals had been aggressive, direct, and overconfident. They had expected the Concord to fight the way it had always fought, and when James changed the rules, they had not known how to respond. They had died confused. Corvale did not make that mistake. He was patient, he was quiet, and most dangerously of all, he was willing to learn. In his first month commanding the Virathi campaign, Corvale did not launch a single major offensive. Instead, he studied. He pulled apart every recording of James's tactics at Meridian Core. He analyzed the patterns, the deceptions, the way James used chaos as a weapon. And then he began to adapt. The first sign of trouble came at the Battle of Voss Reach. James had set a trap, the same kind of layered deception that had worked beautifully at Meridian Core. False retreats, hidden flanking forces, a kill zone designed to catch the Varathi in a crossfire. It was textbook James Morrow. Corvale did not fall for it. He recognized the pattern, held his fleet back, and sent probing forces to map the real positions of the Concorde ships. When James adjusted, Corvale adjusted faster. The battle ended in a draw, which for James was the same as a defeat. A draw meant the Varathi still had their fleet intact, and time was on their side. The easy victories were over. What followed was the hardest period of the war. James and Corvale fought across dozens of systems in a grinding campaign that consumed ships and lives at a terrible rate. Every battle was a chess match between two minds that had begun to understand each other. James would set a trap. Corvale would see through it. Corvale would try to bait James into overextending. James would refuse. They circled each other like predators, each one probing for the weakness the other refused to show. Meanwhile, inside the Concorde, the political war was getting worse. Chancellor Dreth had never accepted James's authority. He had been quiet after Meridian Core, when the mood of the galaxy was too favorable toward humanity to challenge openly. But as the war dragged on, and the victories became harder and costlier, Dreth saw his opportunity. He began leaking selective information to the Concorde media. Casualty numbers without context, failed engagements without mentioning the strategic gains they secured. Stories about human recklessness, human disregard for alien lives, the fundamental danger of giving a primitive species control over the fate of civilizations that had existed for millennia. Public opinion began to shift. Not everywhere, but enough. Protests appeared on some Concorde worlds. Delegates who had supported James began to hesitate. James knew about the political attacks. He said nothing about them. He had a war to fight, and he could not afford to fight on two fronts. But Salith saw the toll it was taking. He slept less. He ate less. The calm that had defined him was still there, but it had become thinner, like ice over deep water. Then came the assassination attempt. James was traveling between fleet positions in a diplomatic shuttle when the engine core detonated. The shuttle broke apart in the void of space. Emergency rescue teams found the wreckage scattered across 3 kilometers. They did not expect survivors. Salith was aboard the command ship when the report came in. She heard the words, "shuttle destroyed," and no life signs detected. And she felt something crack inside her chest that she had not known was there. She commandeered a rescue vessel personally. She flew to the wreckage field. She searched for 2 hours in the frozen debris, directing scanners, refusing to stop, refusing to accept what everyone else had already accepted. She found him in the remains of the shuttle's emergency compartment. He was alive, barely. The blast had thrown him into a reinforced section of the hull, and the emergency systems had sealed around him and kept him breathing. He was burned, broken, and unconscious, but his heart was still beating. When he woke up in the medical bay 3 days later, Salith was sitting beside his bed. She had not left. The doctors had tried to make her go. She had refused in terms that left no room for discussion. James looked at her through swollen eyes. "Report," he said, his first word. "You almost died." "Almost does not count," he said, and tried to sit up, and failed, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and held him down, with a gentleness that surprised them both. The investigation into the shuttle revealed sabotage. The device had been placed in the engine core by someone with access to Concorde security systems. The trail went cold before it reached anyone specific, but the message was clear. Someone inside the Concorde wanted James dead more than they wanted to win the war. James was back on his feet in 10 days. The doctors said he needed a month. He gave them 10 days and walked out of the medical bay with a slight limp that he never quite lost. He threw himself back into the war and launched Operation Pale Horse, the largest Concorde offensive since the war began. It was a multi-front campaign designed to stretch Corvale's forces across too many systems at once, forcing him to choose what to defend and what to abandon. It was also brutal. The offensive worked. Corvale was forced to pull back from 3 entire sectors. Concord forces advanced further in 2 weeks than they had in 2 months. But the cost was staggering. An entire human carrier group, 4,000 people, was destroyed, buying time for the main assault on the Corvale's supply lines. James had placed them in the path of a Virathi counterattack, knowing they would not survive. They held their position for 11 hours, long enough for the main fleet to complete its objective. None of them made it out. Earth mourned. The names of 4,000 humans were read aloud in every colony, and the silence that followed was the kind that settles into the bones of a civilization. James did not sleep for 4 days. He sat in his command center, staring at reports, running simulations. Salith came to him on the 4th night and found him sitting in the dark with his hands pressed flat on the table, very still. "You need to rest," she said. "If I rest, I will think about what I did," he said. "And if I think about what I did, I will not be able to do what I need to do tomorrow." She sat down beside him. She did not tell him it was necessary. She did not tell him it was justified. She simply sat with him in the dark and said, "Then I will stay until tomorrow." Something changed between them that night, not with words or grand declarations, but with the simple act of presence. She stayed. He let her. And from that point forward, they stopped pretending that this marriage was anything less than real. Salith addressed the Concord Assembly the next day. She stood before the delegates and spoke about the war, about sacrifice, about the cost of what they were asking of one man and one species. She spoke without the careful, layered diplomacy of her people. She spoke plainly, the way James would have. And her voice shook once, just once, when she described what it looked like to watch someone order the deaths of his own people to save a galaxy that still was not sure it respected him. The assembly was silent. Some delegates looked away. Others looked at her with something new in their eyes. Then Corvale changed his strategy, and the war entered its darkest phase. Unable to defeat James in fleet engagements, Corvale began targeting civilian populations. Colony worlds burned. Refugee ships were destroyed in transit. The Virathi struck soft targets with surgical precision, hitting the places James could not protect without pulling his fleets out of position. Corva knew that James would try to save everyone, and that the attempt would tear his strategy apart. James stood at the tactical display, watching the distress signals multiply across the map. Each one was a world screaming for help. Each one was a choice he could not avoid. He could not save them all. He knew it. Salith knew it. And in the silence of the command center, she watched the man she had married for politics and learned to love through war face the one thing that no strategy could solve. Then he paused. He leaned closer to the display. His eyes moved across the pattern of Virathi attacks, and something clicked behind them. "They are not random," he said softly. "He is hurting us." Every civilian attack was pushing the Concord fleet in the same direction, toward the same region of space, a vast, sensor-dead zone called the Void of Calith, where scanners saw nothing, and no one could see in. "Corvale is setting a trap," James said. "The entire Virathi Dominion fleet is waiting in that void. He wants us to rush in blind to save the colonies." Salith felt cold. "Then what do we do?" James stared at the void on the map for a long time. Then he said, "We spring the trap, on our terms." James stood before the War Council for the last time and told them he was going to walk into a trap on purpose. The chamber went very quiet. 14 species stared at him. Some thought he had lost his mind. Others, the ones who had learned to trust him over months of impossible victories, leaned forward and waited for the rest. He laid it out with the same steady calm he brought to everything. Corvale had positioned the full strength of the Virathi Dominion inside the void of Calith, a region of dead space where sensors could not reach. The civilian attacks were bait, designed to pull the Concord fleet into the void in a desperate, disorganized rush. Once inside, blind and scattered, they would be surrounded and destroyed. The war would end in a single afternoon. "He expects us to come in panicked and unprepared," James said. "So we will come in prepared, and he will not know the difference until it is too late." Then he revealed something that made even Salith stare at him. For months, quietly, without telling anyone, James had been positioning reserve fleets. Small groups of ships pulled from secondary systems, hidden in deep space, running silent on minimal power. Dozens of them, scattered in a wide arc, around the far side of the void of Calith. They had been drifting into position for weeks, some of them for months. Every battle, every retreat, every engagement that had seemed like desperation or improvisation had also been a positioning move, sliding ships into place for this single moment. He had seen this coming, not the specific details, but the shape of it. He had known that Corvale would eventually try something like this, and he had been building the counter from the day he took command. Admiral Vorath, who had once called James a clerk, sat back in his chair and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "You have been playing a different game than all of us, from the beginning." James did not deny it. "The plan is a pincer," he said. "We enter the void from the front, as Corvale expects. We engage his fleet and hold his attention. While he commits his forces to the kill, the reserve fleets close in from behind and seal the exit. He will be surrounded by the same trap he built for us." It was enormous. It was insane. It required perfect timing across dozens of fleet groups spread across light years of space, with no sensor contact and no room for error. It was exactly the kind of plan that only a human would try. The council voted. For once, it was nearly unanimous. But there was one more betrayal left to come. Chancellor Dreth, who had spent months undermining James, who had never accepted human authority and never would, made his final move. Using a back channel that the intelligence service had not yet discovered, he sent a message to the Virathi. Not the full plan, but enough. Enough to warn Corvale that something was coming. Enough to destroy everything. Salith found out because she had been watching Dreth for weeks. She had placed her own people in his communication staff, a precaution that went against every tradition of Aelithari political courtesy. When the message was intercepted before it could leave the ship, she went to Dreth personally. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She stood before him in the assembly chamber, in front of every delegate, every officer, every aide and analyst and diplomat in the Concord's government. And she invoked an authority that had not been used in 400 years. As sovereign heir of the Aelithari ascendancy, she stripped Chancellor Dreth of his rank, his titles, his privileges, and his name. In Aelithari culture, losing your name was worse than death. It meant you had never existed at all. Dreth stared at her with hollow eyes. "You would destroy me for a human?" he whispered. "I would destroy you for treason," she said. "The human has nothing to do with it." But everyone in the room knew that was not entirely true. The fleet launched the next day. Thousands of ships from 14 species, moving together under a single command for the first and perhaps last time in galactic history. James stood on the bridge of the command ship Throne of Stars, Salith beside him, and watched the void approach on the main display. It looked like nothing, a black patch of space where the stars seemed to end. No signals came out, no signals went in. Somewhere inside that darkness, the entire Virathi war machine was waiting. "All fleets maintain formation," James said. "We go in together, and we come out together." They entered the void. For 20 minutes, there was silence. The fleet moved forward in the dark, guided only by pre-calculated coordinates and the steady voice of their commander. Then, the void lit up. The Virathi fleet was larger than anyone had predicted. Thousands of warships, arranged in a perfect sphere of death around the point where the Concord fleet had entered. They opened fire from every direction simultaneously. The first minutes were hell. Ships exploded, shields failed, communications broke down in the sensor-dead environment, and for a terrible moment, the Concord fleet was exactly what Corvale had wanted it to be. Blind, scattered, and dying. James did not panic. He had planned for this. The forward fleet was not meant to win. It was meant to survive long enough. All forward groups, defensive sphere, he ordered. Tighten formation. Do not chase. Do not scatter. Hold the center. The Concord fleet pulled together like a fist, absorbing fire from every direction, buying time minute by bloody minute. Saylith stood at the communication station, relaying orders to fleet groups that could barely hear through the interference. Her hands moved across the controls with precision, her voice steady and clear, even as the deck shook beneath her feet. Somewhere in the darkness behind the Virathi fleet, the reserve forces were closing in. The signal came 17 minutes into the battle. A single burst transmission from the far side of the void, repeating on all frequencies. The reserve fleets had reached their positions. The ring was closing. James allowed himself one breath. Then he said, "All reserve groups, execute." From behind the Virathi fleet, from every direction they had not thought to guard, dozens of Concord battle groups lit their engines and opened fire. The Virathi sphere, designed to crush the fleet in front of it, suddenly found itself caught between two forces. The hunters had become the trapped. He pulled his forces into a tight defensive formation and tried to punch through the reserve line at its weakest point. It was the right move, the only move, and it almost worked. The fighting at the breakout point was the most savage of the entire war. Ships rammed each other at close range. Entire squadrons were wiped out in seconds. But James had placed his strongest group at that exact point, because he had known Corvale would try to break out there. He had been thinking like Corvale for months. He knew the man's instincts as well as he knew his own. The breakout failed. The Virathi fleet was encircled. A direct hit struck the Throne of Stars. The bridge split open. Consoles exploded. Officers were thrown across the deck. James was slammed into a support beam and felt something in his side break. He pulled himself up, blood running down his face, and looked at the tactical display, which was cracked but still functioning. Saylith was already back on her feet, pulling an injured officer away from a sparking console. She looked at James. He looked at her. Neither of them said a word. She went back to the communication station. He went back to the tactical display. Together, in the burning wreckage of the command deck, they fought the final phase of the battle. It took 2 more hours. The Virathi fleet was methodically surrounded, divided, and destroyed. Ship by ship, group by group, the Dominion's military spine was broken in the dark of the Calith void. Corvale's flagship was the last to fall. Before the end, a communication came through on an open channel. Corvale's voice, calm even in defeat, speaking directly to James. "You were never in our models," Corvale said. "We planned for every species in the Concord. We accounted for every variable. But not you. What are you?" James looked at the display showing Corvale's crippled ship, surrounded on all sides, and he said, "I am what happens when you corner something that learned to fight before it learned to fly." The channel went dead. Corvale's flagship fired its last weapons, and then it was over. The Virathi Dominion surrendered 3 weeks later. The Treaty of Calith was signed in the same grand hall where James and Saylith had been married, in a ceremony that neither of them had believed would mean anything. Humanity was granted a permanent seat on the High Council. Not out of gratitude, though there was gratitude, out of the simple understanding that a species like this could not be kept in the back of the room any longer. James resigned his command the day after the treaty was signed. He walked away from the most powerful military position in the galaxy and went back to diplomacy. When asked why, he said, "Because wars are won, so they can end. And someone needs to do the quiet work that comes after." Salith renewed their marriage bond in a private ceremony. Just the two of them, in the Aelithari tradition. No politics, no audience, just the exchange of light between two people who had found each other inside a war and come out the other side, still holding on. A courtier later asked her whether she regretted the arrangement. She looked at him with those silver eyes and said, "I married a human to secure an alliance. I stayed married to him because he saved a civilization, and then asked if anyone needed help with the paperwork." On the observation deck of a rebuilt space station above Meridian Core, James and Salith stood side by side and watched Earth's fleet pass in review. The ships were battered, scarred, and fewer than when the war had started. But they flew in perfect formation, steady and unbroken, the way humans had always moved through the universe. Forward, no matter what. Salith reached over and took his hand. For an Aelithari, that gesture was more than a kiss, more than a vow. It was a declaration before the stars themselves. James squeezed back. He did not say anything. He did not need to. And somewhere, in intelligence offices across the galaxy, species that had never met a human were updating their records. Under the entry for humanity, old assessments were deleted and replaced with 3 lines that would remain unchanged for 1,000 years. Do not engage. Do not underestimate. Do not corner.